Welcome to Uncovered, the Bible as Historical Document. You probably know the Bible as a religious book. Maybe you even own one or read one. But at its core, it is a collection of ancient primary manuscripts. In this show, we will examine the Bible from the perspective of a historian to examine its historicity and manuscript strength, to see if we can uncover why the founders of the United States thought this book held value for the construction of our civic system. Our host is history professor and theologian Dr. Carl Kriesman. Joining Carl is Matthew Porter, a writer, director, and creative executive.
Hey, Matthew.
Hey, Carl.
How you doing, buddy?
I'm good. We're back. You're back.
I am back. Because you're right. I was gone. I went up to see my youngest in South Carolina.
That's good. Beautiful part of the country.
It was. They were complaining of it being hot, and I'm like, I'm from Florida.
Yeah. Slow your roll. We know hot.
Yeah, we're a little closer to the sun than you guys. We went to a battlefield. There's a Revolutionary War battlefield.
Well, that's where it all went down, started.
Well, yeah, no. Well,
come on.
No.
Fort Sumter? No?
Yes. That's Civil War.
What'd you say?
Revolutionary War.
Revolutionary War.
Did I say Civil War?
I quit this podcast.
Yeah, no. Revolutionary War.
That I know did not start in South Carolina.
Little tiny battle that people don't even know
no
really
kidding.
existed. Yeah, it's really one of the big ones. But Guilford Courthouse.
Guilford Courthouse.
But it's right near where she lives.
Oh, nice.
And I love doing that kind of stuff. In fact, the kids have a joke that we're on a vacation when we go to a museum or a battlefield.
Yeah. That's just a part of what you guys do.
At one point, we were in the little museum. It's very small. And unbeknownst to me, she took a picture of me reading a sign from behind, and then she sent it to the family. And she said, "Now we're on vacation."
Now it's official. Well, speaking of history, let's go in the time machine all the way back to last episode.
Okay.
One of the things that we kind of used to kind of frame this whole venture is, what is a historian? Why are you a historian?
Correct.
Refresh us as we kind of start out on this thing again.
Yeah, and it's just the idea that I've spent my adult life, well, really further. I mean, the story I tell people, because students ask me all the time, it's like, when did you start liking history? And it's like, well, I had an amazing sixth grade teacher. It would happen to be at the same rough time. I was talking to my mom, and we didn't have the same chronology on this, but the same rough time as our bicentennial at 1776. And as hopefully will happen next year when we're at the 250 for the Declaration of Independence.
Sesquicentennial, some kind of weird word.
It's a word. I've learned I need to learn how to say it, but at this point, I'll just say 250. It's our 250. And because I heard somebody say it online, and they said it, and it was like lots of syllables.
You win Scrabble with that word.
Yeah, with that word. You get that word going. And, the country did all kinds of cool stuff. They had a bicentennial train. They had a regular train that ran over all the tracks, and it went all across the country. As far as I know, it hit all 50 states. It was painted red, white, and blue. You could actually buy one. I think one of the train companies, Lionel or somebody made one, a little HO gauge, and they made one, and I got one of those.
That's cool.
And it rolled into town, and it had all kinds of. It had the Declaration of Independence inside. It had a whole bunch of historical stuff from our archives, and they were showing it, take it to the people. It was amazing. And everybody was really excited, and I just sort of really fell in love with history at that point. So I've had this lifetime pursuit of history. So anybody could say that. We referenced, Savage from Mythbusters. Is he really a scientist? Well, he doesn't have the degree for it. I do happen to have the degree, a master's degree. But then that leads me to have this kind of insight or experiential insight as to doing research. What does research look like? Doesn't make me the only person who can do this or do research or have better knowledge than someone else.
Right.
But we felt like I do have the credentials to say I'm a historian. And so as we want to look at the Bible, and particularly as we're saying the founders found it of value, not as the singular thing, but as a core piece of what was necessary for the structure of their civic system, the thing we talked about in the previous podcast, and Unmoored. So we said, well, let's look at it as a historian. And a key part of that, and that's really where we're going to go today, but a key part of that is this word we talked about last time of historicity. It's a word I kind of like. It's a fancy word.
It is a fancy word.
It's basically that idea of is the thing you're talking about. So it could be a stone. It could be again, I was on the battlefield.
Right.
So you're looking at things on this battlefield, and there's ground there, but in the museum, they've got all kinds of stuff, like things that they found there, documents that that are included, that are connected. And so then I'm looking in a museum. How do I know any of those things were legit, not just made up. I mean, you've probably seen little mini balls from the Civil War, Revolutionary War, just a little round metal thing.
Right.
And somebody says, that was a bullet from that time, but I don't know that.
How do I know that? Yeah.
And so, the idea then of having someone who has skill and technology and expertise to say, yes, we've tested this, whether it's a written document or a hard artifact, to then say, yep, legit, this is from that very moment. And so that's something we can say as evidence. And so, again, historicity, bringing historical authenticity, historical actuality, somebody might say, and meaning as opposed to being something that's mythical, a legend, or just basic fiction. So we're going to dig in. I don't think we're going to get through this episode, but when we say what historians and history and all that kind of stuff, I thought it's useful to kind of let's start with this question. So I'm going to ask you, Matthew.
Yeah.
What is it that historians do?
Well, Carl, I knew we were going to talk about this, and so I asked my buddy ChatGPT. I'm a fellow Gen Xer like you, so that means we embrace new technology, but at the same time, I'm still printing it out on a dead tree.
Exactly.
So, all right, I'll run this by you. You tell me if this checks out, if this is
Go
legit.
for it.
So this is what AI told me. Historians study and interpret the past. Their goal is to understand how events unfolded, why they happened, and what they meant to the people who lived through them, as well as how they continue to affect the present. Here's a breakdown of what historians actually do. Research, analyze and interpret, tell stories, challenge assumptions, and teach and share knowledge. Does that pass the Dr. Carl test?
Heck yeah.
All right.
That's good. ChatGPT coming in for the win.
Score.
I like it. AI. See, they're going to replace us. It's coming.
Yeah.
It's coming. Yeah, so one way to say it is that historians create the best probable narrative of a person, of a place, of an event. So I just mentioned, the battle at Guilford Courthouse. So tell the story. In fact, we went on a tour with the one of the park rangers. I dutifully told him that I mentioned nothing about being a historian, because whenever I do that, and I've been in places where either my child has said something or it's come out, the whole talk changes because they're either worried or they're trying to show off or whatever, or and I just play dumb and didn't say anything. And that way, because there's a lot I can learn. I don't know that battlefield. That person knows the battlefield far more than I do. So just let them be the expert without having to throw any credential information out there.
Yeah.
So he has obviously hours and dozens and lots of information that he has at his disposal. It was a gentleman. It could have been a lady. And the historian then, her role then is to kind of help the person who doesn't know, in this case, me and my daughter, understand the narrative. And they're giving the best probable narrative.
Yeah, and it feels like in that sense, it's almost like science. This is, as of right now, our best understanding of science, how this works, history, how this happened. But it doesn't get calcified. It's got to be, if you give me new evidence, I have to be open to letting this go and embracing this new one if it meets the standard for
exactly. And that's true for all types of history. So like yesterday, events happened in your life and my life. We interfaced in a couple of those moments, right? But if we were to tell somebody, you couldn't tell somebody the whole thing without going through an exact 24 hours. So then after that moment, if you're going to summarize, you're going to be giving your best understanding of the events that happened. And if you're explaining, and you would be, other people to whom you are not, so you don't know exactly their motivations and their thoughts and where exactly they did everything, you're now giving best probable certainty based on, like you said, the evidence at your disposal. All right? Okay, so that's what a historian does. So then it's sort of similar, but just kind of triangulating down a little bit. This raises the question of, well, how do we even define what history is? You want to take a stab at that?
It's everything that happened up till now. Till now.
Yes.
I don't know. It's a weird question.
It is a weird question, right? So here's the definition that I use. Our knowledge of the past based on testimony on what evidence we have to the events. So it's our knowledge of the past based on evidence testimony.
All right.
Right?
That works.
And as you said, 5 minutes ago, something happened that's in history. Now, I will tell people that until you're about 50 to 70 years out, it's all current events. And And the reason is because we're too close to the event.
Right.
For lots of things you could get into. For instance, Vietnam now is in that 70-year range, right? But there's still people alive who both fought and or didn't fight intentionally and or lost somebody in either category. So they're very deeply motivated and have an opinion that would drive their thoughts about that event in Vietnam.
It's interesting that things happening now will never be closer than right now to the facts, but you also are far removed from any kind of perspective.
Exactly. It's like if you think about a painting on a wall, like you went to a museum, if you went nose to the thing, you could see some colors. You could see some outline maybe of what was on there, but you'd have really no context of what you're seeing. You got to pull way back. And then if you add in from a modern point of view, information can still be considered classified, secret, not in the open.
Yeah.
So think how long it was before the wall fell in Berlin and the kind of Cold War comes to an end roughly 89, 91. In 91, 92, historians flocked to Moscow and to Russia, desperately trying to use this open moment to get in and see what could we see in your archives, because our understanding of World War II, which is now even further back, 80 plus years or so, we don't have their info. We have their understanding of it because we can read some of their own produced secondary histories, but you don't have the exact information.
Seems like there's an undefined but still definite window of time that would be ideal, where you're far enough removed, but the people involved are still alive.
Right, particularly if you want personal interaction and oral history.
You've got
right.
I just finished a documentary project about a historical black school, and we interviewed people who are, well, put it this way, in the months prior to this interview with these three people, there was 2 or 3 alumni who left us,
who passed.
So it's like you better get your story,
which
stories from them.
So leads me to a third question, which I'll lead with a kind of story. So the third question then is understanding that when you say how the job of the historian triangulates, connects to the history, then you're really asking a question: is how does anyone know anything about the past, particularly when you think of antiquity, which we'll worry about that word in a minute. And the answer is evidence, and you're looking for evidence. And so you remember back in science class, I don't know if they ask young kids these questions anymore, but if a tree falls in a forest, does it ever make a sound?
Right.
And of course the answer is yes, sound waves are produced. And now we know we have listening instruments that can be thousands of miles away and can pick that up. Well, my take on this is if a tree falls in a forest and no one ever wrote down that there was a forest, did the tree exist? And the answer is no, because it is gone from history.
Yeah.
Now, of course, yes, some scientists could go and find some evidence if they dug in what was then maybe a desert or an urban city. But the reality of the point of me making this kind of little simple joke off that old saw for science is that without the evidence, so when you say you lost someone, everything they knew, if it wasn't written down, was taken from us. And so then it just vanishes. From
a practical point, from a effective point of view, if something is forgotten, essentially, it never happened.
Exactly.
It happened, but
it didn't.
What ripple has it made?
Exactly. So this gets really challenging for us. And when I say antiquity, we're typically talking at least in the BC era, if not into the first centuries of the AD era. I'm not sure exactly where maybe someone else might draw the line between antiquity and just old history, but you're basically going back. So help me think for a second. What is the best kind of evidence? And so, for instance, you may not remember this. You were young, but in March of 1981, there was an attempted assassination on President Reagan's life.
That's right.
Yeah. So if you were thinking, I need to construct the probable narrative about this, what evidence would you imagine we would use or find to help us? Like somebody says there was a guy named Reagan and he was assassinated and he was the president. You say, okay, I wasn't here. I didn't see it. I wasn't there. So I don't know any of that stuff. What would be some of the evidence you think we might use?
You could talk to people who were alive at that time, what they remember.
We'd see if there were any eyewitnesses who were there.
News reports.
So we would have some video things we could see. It'd be in the paper.
Be in the paper.
We could look for papers. We know the date is March the 30th. We know it's 1981. At least that's what we're told. If you and I were just examining this neutral, like we don't remember it, we could go search, the big papers, local papers. It happened in D.C., I'm pretty sure. So we could look there. We could look at the city we live in, kind of see that.
Yeah, it'd be police files of some kind, whether you could access them or not.
Right.
Medical details, again, whether that was released or not. But
there might still be hard evidence, right? He was rushed into his, presidential car. I don't think it took damage, but it might have. There certainly were shots fired, so there might have been police casings that were kept maybe by the police or something like that. Might have been photos.
Right.
This is obviously pre-phone, so there'd be no phone pictures or any text or any emails, none of that kind of evidence.
Right.
Somebody might have made a drawing. There might have been drawing in a paper. That might have been like that. Again, testimonies. Okay. So now let's make it harder. So you and I both have watched a movie about a very famous battle back long ago, the Battle of Thermopylae.
That's right.
Which is in the 480, but it's in the 400s BC.
That's right.
So think about that. So we've been told that there was this famous battle fought in Thermopylae is in Greece, for those who may not know. And the famous connection is that there were, do you remember what that
300.
is? 300.
Yes.
The movie 300, which we saw together, and 300 people from a place called Sparta. And they apparently fought, according to the story, against a massive army of tens of thousands. We'll come back to what the sources say, but a super large number. So there's supposedly a battle there. You weren't there.
I wasn't there.
I wasn't there. We got a graphic novel.
Yep.
But I mean,
Frank Miller.
he could have just made that up.
True.
So how would we know? What would be some evidence that we could maybe have that could help us figure that one out?
Well, we're missing a lot of stuff from modern era, like you mentioned, any electronic stuff. So there would be hopefully some kind of written record.
Okay. So somebody would write about it.
Yeah.
Maybe either a diary, a personal, I was there, or I'm the brother of somebody who was there.
Something.
Or an account,
Yep.
so an accounting of it. So a historian writing, so this is where you get into real picky things between a primary source and a secondary source. But so a historian or someone giving an account later in a sort of official capacity would be a secondary source. But for us, it would count as a primary source. We would just have to note that, he did that 50 years later or 300 years later or something like that. So there's some written information we could have.
Archaeology, somebody's going to build a Starbucks in Thermopylae or something, and they're like, hey, what's this? And you find stuff, you're like, well, this could align with what we understand.
And we probably could find in archaeology different types of weapons, different types of armors, which would suggest from two different places. Obviously, physically, we're told Thermopylae, the hot gates, is there a certain unique structure? There's certain things in that. We could go and find if that actually exists. It turns out it does. We could find out there was a place called Sparta that actually existed, so we can find that, and then there's information there. We're told the name of the king, Leonidas, so we could see if that name is just made up by Frank Miller or somebody else, or did it exist in various records. All these things would be the kind of stuff that would give us confidence to this story. We know this is in connection to a large event involving the Persian Empire led by Xerxes at the time. And that kind of connects into the greater kind of Greco-Persian wars that are occurring at this time period. So you kind of can begin to work from any Persian sources that might have mentioned the invasion. They might or might not have mentioned Thermopylae, depending on how the sources go. So all those things are the evidence that we can build. And so you can quickly kind of imagine that, every event that happens will have different amounts of evidence. And that gives us greater or less confidence. And again, what we're doing, we're building the narrative to the best probable certainty that we can. And you said something earlier that I was going to jump in on, is that what I feel like a historian should always be saying, and hopefully our listeners hear this from me, is with almost every paragraph, particularly when you're recounting a historical thing, every sentence, every paragraph, you should hear the unstated comma, as best we know the evidence.
Yes.
Meaning the potential for more evidence to emerge is there, and from a historical point of view, welcomed.
Yes.
Like we want Nicolas Cage to go find the Library of Alexandria's lost stuff, like he did in the I forget the movie. It's,
National Treasure.
National Treasure. Thanks.
It's like history came to life.
We want that, right?
Yes.
Because then we would find more information.
Right.
We're very and if you pay attention at all, particularly over the past 50 years, there's really seemingly been an explosion of discovery in a whole variety of fields, in locations and people groups, and all this does is give us greater depth and fill in the picture even better.
So a historian or even a layperson can speak to an historical fact with confidence, and at the same time, it's not a contradiction for them to be able to go, you present me better evidence, we'll go with that. So you can hold them in both those in your hand at the same time.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think there's a sense in which then a good historian is constantly weighing and judging the evidence that's presented about, again, the person, the place, the event. And not that we keep a record like that's at 75% and that's at 92%, that kind of a thing. In fact, I would say if you pick up any basic world history textbook or any basic Western civilization textbook that starts in antiquity and works forward, the narrative is trustworthy. But this is important for us because, again, now to think about the Bible just for a quick second, that's a part of normal human history, the Bible and the 66 documents that are in there, these ancient manuscripts that are telling a story. And so we're trying to say, well, can I trust those? Is there merit to those, or are there questions? But we're approaching it like a historian. So we're not approaching it from a religious value point of view, which has a different maybe set of metrics. But if I can say that there was a battle at Thermopylae, or I can say that there was a man named Ronald Reagan and he became president and there was an attempted assassination, and I wasn't there and I didn't see it, I can then say similar judgment about things that are in other sources, such as these 66 manuscripts. So that leads me to then the judging of evidence, right? So now when you think about in either of the events we just talked about, and I'm going to give you two others here in a second. You start saying, okay, stack up the evidence for me. Like, let me see all the pieces of the puzzle that then allow us to conclude this thing happened in the way that we're told that it happened. And then are there questions? Are there discrepancies? And what do we do with some of those discrepancies? And do we just say, oh, the event didn't happen? Or just sort of acknowledge that maybe there's some things there, but what does a historian do relative to that? So the first thing I would say is the burden of proof related to historicity falls on the historian. People are not generally compulsive liars, and particularly when you think in terms of say, somebody in Sparta making a mural or a painting, or somebody writing a diary like we talked about, or first-person interview in 1981, you were there when this happened. What did you? They're typically not liars. They probably do not have all the information, and the good historian then knows that and kind of works with that. But we don't just go, oh, as I'm reading this document, particularly with antiquity, that somehow it's not useful for us. Most documentary evidence is firsthand, a diary, a letter to a spouse, business information. When we look about places from antiquity and we say, what did they do in those cities? A lot of times we'll have like, what is the account, almost like accounting information where they're not lying. It's just something they recorded and we find, but it gives us information. There is, as I said, secondary information, like it's written by a historian like Tacitus or Herodotus who wrote about the Greco-Persian Wars. And we do need to think in terms of bias. We need to think in terms of minority voice. But as we're thinking about the historicity of the document in front of us, like, did Tacitus lie? What I'm really kind of considering is I need to give the document in front of me the benefit of the doubt until it proves itself to be false, or, a consistent set of lies that maybe this author wrote. Then I can begin to say, okay, I don't know if I can trust this document, what it's telling me. And we have to also keep in mind then, particularly with antiquity, given that something may seem hard to grasp or even contradictory, does not mean untrue on its face. It doesn't mean that the text is in error.
Right.
If we did say that, we basically couldn't claim to know anything prior to around the 1400s or so.
Right.
And that's kind of, in one sense, I know the 1400s is not antiquity for somebody listening who knows history also. But I would say that, there's something that happens, in the 1400s that helps us, kind of in this process. Do you know what I'm alluding to? I'm totally leading you on there.
You are totally leading. So I'll act like I'm just coming up with the answer off the top of my head. That would be the printing press, Mr.
Gutenberg.
Mr. Gutenberg.
Yeah.
Herr Gutenberg.
Yeah. And so the point obviously is the moment you have the press, I mean, I've printed things for you. You've printed things for people. It's a copy of your original that's on a computer screen somewhere. The fact that it's printed, you could print multiple copies or use a copy machine. They're identical. So we don't have to worry about that. The challenge for us with antiquity and the challenge with us really prior to around the 1100s is we have no originals. So now what I'm talking about is, imagine that diary we talked about, or usually a diary is not really famous enough to be in that setting, but I'm going to introduce you to a man named Cicero. He's from the Roman Republic days. He's got a series of letters. Some of his letters, because he was important, were saved, right? So whether it's diaries or letters or some official accounts, we have no originals if it's on like papyrus or the equivalent of paper, right? There obviously are originals if it's like hieroglyphics or cuneiform in some kind of a stone or clay baked setting that they used to write in some of the earliest societies. But in general terms, if we think about most things that are written for us, and written evidence is really the leading evidence for historians. It's kind of the main thing that helps us see something. When it's just archaeological evidence, we can say, well, it looks like a weapon. It looks like a pot. They might have cooked here. We can find some certain things in the ground that suggest this might be a graveyard or maybe some place where they had a slaughterhouse, and that we can make some allusions from that. But our clarity is really not there.
Yeah.
Till you get the written documents.
Yeah.
The written documents really help us kind of grasp the narrative we're trying to construct in the story, right? Let me see if I say it right. The way I typically say it to students is prior to the 1100s, we just don't have any. Around the 1100s, we start picking up some poems. One of the earliest ones that we know of is there's a written document from the Spanish captain El Cid, which is dated in 1096. I told you a minute ago, I'm constantly keeping up with things that are happening in the field because I'm just interested. And last year, there was a finding coming out of, I believe, Hungary, in which there's the potential, and I've not seen a follow-up of this yet, that they had found some original documents from the 900s. Didn't necessarily say what they were. We don't really care as historians. But when you begin to find original documents, that's very exciting for us, because the difference, obviously, that raises questions is the fact that going from the original to a copy, the potential steps in for there to be some errors made in the copy that obviously the printing press and subsequent, you don't have that problem. You still have handwritten things post-printing press.
Right.
So there can be errors in that regard if somebody hand copies information. But in general terms, we have more autographs post-Gutenberg and less going back. So then when you look at something like the Bible, which is set, from roughly 2000 to 100 AD, 2000 BC to 100 AD is where these documents fall, or anything from that time period, ancient Egypt, Mesopotamian Valley, the Greek city-states, the Roman Republic, you're looking at information that's written that we don't have the original of. So we have a document that we know was from that moment. So we have Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars, or we have something written by Tacitus, but we don't have the original. We have a copy of that. And that original, just for what it's worth, is called I call it, the way it looks on paper, the autograph. I think it's called the autographa. But if you think about an autograph from a hero, what you're getting in that moment is their real signature. You're standing there, they sign their real signature. It's really them. And that's kind of the connection between that and how it's used in the field of the autograph being the original document. Again, so we have none of those. And there's a whole field we're not going to get in. Well, we'll touch on it later, but of like textual scholarship that people spend their whole lives becoming experts in certain languages, certain contexts, certain writing styles within if it's a long-term society where they shifted in kind of writing and communication, so that they then can be the persons who look at the ancient copies that we have and then kind of help us construct the best possible version of. So in this, I mentioned Julius Caesar. So he wrote about his wars in ancient Gaul, modern France, and he calls it the Gallic Wars. So we don't have the original, but we have copies that allow us. You can go buy this on Barnes & Noble or Amazon or something. You can buy a copy of Tacitus's writings or Plutarch's writings. But when you're reading, you're going, is this really what they wrote? Well, we would say, yes, we feel very confident it is based on the manuscripts that we have. But we also know that it is fundamentally impossible to recreate the document variant free. In other words, as you have copies, you're going to have places where words may be misspelled. There could be a line that might have been skipped.
Right.
Maybe someone occasionally added something in, like they felt like it wasn't clear and they felt like something was added in. And there's a whole bunch of rules that textual critics, and we'll look at some of these. But the key thing is that no work of antiquity is 100% free of variance. So when we think about the Bible or we think about any other writing from antiquity, that's kind of an accepted, that's the way it is. And we're, again, remembering to give the evidence the benefit of the doubt. Okay, I want to pause there for a second. Does that all make sense for you?
Yeah. Once you take a step away from the original, there's some margin for, like you said, variance, but that does not mean it is without value at all. You just have to factor that in. And like you said, you talked about stacking up the evidence, and that's exactly what I've seen, almost like layers, to understand something.
Yeah. So if we have the Battle of Thermopylae and we have some written information, now let's say there's 5 different written things. We take each one of them and we say, okay, what's the historicity strength of that written thing? So it could be a letter, it could be Herodotus, it could be something. Then we begin saying, okay, how can I know that I'm looking at the best possible version of this thing and that it's legit? And there's 2 main categories, at least that I use. One is, how many copies do we have?
Okay.
The more copies, the better.
Right.
Gives us more opportunity to see where errors may lie, or variance, not really errors, but variation in the documents, misspellings or lines added or missing. And then the span of years from the original, like we know it was written at this moment. In most documents in antiquity, we at least can triangulate down to a year or so. It was written in this year. Sometimes we have a good hard date. Sometimes it's not. But then when's the earliest copy? So for instance, if something was written in 100 BC, but the first copy we have is in 800 AD, then we have a 900-year gap between first autograph and first copy. Now, when you look at that, obviously, the closer in time, the better, right? That's the thing you would prefer to have.
Right.
And what's interesting is, if you look at this, you can recognize, or when you look at the data, you start realizing, oh my goodness, we're lucky to have any information about antiquity, because across the board, we have low numbers of copies and we have great gaps in time, right? So like the average number of manuscripts for particularly our major historical works that we lean on to understand antiquity is about 150, about 150 copies for each thing we say is written. And the average span of time between original and first copy is about 1,000 years.
Wow.
And so, I've given you, I'm sorry, audience, you can't see it, but I've given you, for instance, a chart. This is just a chart of some major writings from, like, there's something from Plato, there's, again, Gallic Wars, there's Livy, there's Pliny the Elder. And so there's a series of documents, and you can find this online. You can Google this information. And you can say, well, when was it written? And again, we have an idea of when something was written. And what's the earliest manuscript copy that we have? And then how many do we have, right? And one reason I love this chart, and this one was published in 2015, is that it shows that even in the time period of about a 20-year, because I remember when the first one was first published was in the late 20th century, so about 25 years or so, that there's been a growth of copies. So for instance, for Herodotus, we have about 109 copies of his histories, right? Previously, we thought we had 8 copies.
Wow.
So by going from 8 copies that you could still buy back in the day, you could buy histories, from a bookstore, and they would say, this is it. And the experts would have done all their work to say, this is the right one, you can write. But now we're even more confident about if you bought a copy today, because the experts now have more copies to work from. And so if you went down like this list, like with Livy, we have like 90 copies. For Pliny the Elder and his natural history, we have 200 copies. So you kind of can see that there's a very thin line, but still one that as historians we're confident about.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's always the chance, hopefully, more numbers are added as we go. Yeah. So.
Yeah, in one sense, we're lucky we have any of it because there's some really famous writing. So, for instance, I mentioned Livy. So he wrote a thing called Roman History. We know it's 142 volumes, but we only have 35 volumes on 90 manuscripts. Or Tacitus wrote the Histories of Rome, 14 volumes, but we only have 4.5 of them. So we've lost some great history we'd love to have. You may have heard of Josephus. He wrote the Jewish War. We only have currently 9 manuscripts that we can kind of judge and base and build a copy you could buy of Josephus. Now, there are 3 works from antiquity that kind of blow the curve. The most famous one, perhaps, is the Iliad. So the Homer's Iliad is one in which the difference in years is only about 400 years.
Okay.
And the number of manuscripts is over 1700. So there's a significant larger number of manuscripts that supports when you read the Iliad, we're really confident. We understand with only 9 copies of something in another one, we feel good and we would publish it and you could buy a copy of it.
Yeah.
But the experts would tell you we may have some gaps or we may have a few places where we're not certain which is actually what was written. When you get to Homer's Iliad and you've got 1,800 copies, I mean, you feel really good about it.
Yeah.
The New Testament is even better. The New Testament has a gap of only about 50 years from when we know these documents were written and our first copies. And we have almost 6,000 manuscripts in Greek alone. If you included Latin or other later writings, say 4th, 5th, 6th century AD, the number jumps up almost to 30,000.
Wow.
So you think about some documents, we only have, say, 100, have 50. You look at the New Testament as a writing, both the individual 27 documents as well as a collective. You start getting blown away by the amount of evidential support. The Old Testament falls into a slightly different category when it's older, but it's the third of those that kind of blows the curve. It's got a gap of years of about 275 years from when we kind of know final writing to our first copies. Again, we don't have the autograph. Number of manuscript, it's about 10,000, which is more than the Iliad, less than the New Testament, say 30,000. Obviously, this is mostly Hebraic. There are some in Greek that are part of that category. We're going to look at these more in depth next time, but the kind of focus here is just to say we recognize that when we see this large number of documents, what it gives the historian and the expert who's in that critical field is confidence in when I read this, I am reading, basically what was written in the process,
right,
which helps us kind of be more secure in believing that probable narrative that we're creating. Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, again, I keep going back to the science, but samples of something. You're like, I want to find out how many tadpoles are in this pond. I'll just pull one sample. Well, I mean, you could. It would be better is pulling 10 or 50 or 100.
Right.
Now we have more confidence. Now we're pulling from more data.
So I wanted to apply this idea, not to the Bible first. We'll do that next episode. Let's look at some things from history, right? So there's a guy named Julius Caesar.
Yes.
I'm certain you've heard this name. Do you know what happened to that guy?
Yeah, on all days, he gets stabbed on the Ides of March.
Right. So
such a big holiday. So it's just put a damper on it since then.
And do you know anything about the assassination?
Well, I know because I took some years of Latin in high school and college, and we watched a movie of the scene, and very famously, we always made fun of it because of the actor's delivery. He goes, "Et tu, Brutus." We got some mileage out of that. And Brutus said, "Yep, me too."
Yeah, you too, Brutus? Which, if you remember watching the movie Aladdin in Robin Williams' opening monologue as the genie, he riffs through like a whole as always a brilliant exposition of his mental agility, and he throws that in there also. Et tu, Brute? So typically, I was speaking in a group recently and asked them about this, and they came back with et tu, Brute, and I said, how do you know that? And they're like, and they stopped for a minute, and something in the back goes, Shakespeare. I said, exactly. You know that from Shakespeare. Now, if you really dug into it, you'd say, well, Shakespeare got it from Plutarch. Okay, fair enough. But most of us know it from Shakespeare. If I told you that there was some historical person and historical event that was important in our history, but our only evidence was from a playwright 1,600 years later, what would you think?
Might have questions.
I'd have a lot of questions.
Yep.
I'd be like, I don't think that really happened.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of the same thing with Frank Miller, and maybe there wasn't a guy named Leonidas.
Yeah.
You're doing it for effect, which is great. Or maybe there was Leonidas, but how do you know 300 guys died? It sounds more dramatic, so you just say that. And, et tu, Brute kind of, goes in but it's like, is that it? And so just to kind of work our way forward, because Caesar dies at roughly, 44, right? So it's in the same ballpark as the story of Jesus, which we're going to kind of get to later in the podcast series, right? He was killed by a collection of senators who opposed him. They had been people he had actually taken care of and protected, but they're conspirators. The most famous is Marcus Junius Brutus and Cassius Longinus. Cassius is supposedly the mastermind from some of the evidence, although we'll come back to that in a minute. And you say, well, how do we know this besides Shakespeare? Well, we have evidence from contemporary writings of Cicero and Sallust, who were there. And then we have some early Roman histories, most famously perhaps by Nicholas of Damascus. Most famously, I should have said differently. Most unknown is Nicholas of Damascus, but he may have the most good history. But Plutarch and Suetonius. Plutarch's obviously more famous, mostly because of, in this moment, because of Shakespeare. So you're saying, well, what do we know? So let's talk about Cicero for a second. So Ciceroan scholars have full collections of a lot of his writings. He didn't write like a book. He has several speeches. He had some essays that he wrote, some letters that have been collected. And we have one of those, again, no autograph, but we have one of those from 820 and another from around 1000 in that ballpark. Now, we do have some fragments. So remember I told you with the Bible, we have an earliest fragment copy about 50 years from the time it was written. And so we have some early manuscript fragments for Cicero from the 4th century A.D. With Sallust, we have two major collections from the 800s, around the 9th century. Suetonius he wrote his history in 110 AD, so about 150 years after the event. And again, its earliest documentations from the 9th century. Now, the 9th century is because of work by Charlemagne. So there's a whole nother story which we don't have time to get into. But in Charlemagne's work, he began this interest in learning and literature and writing. And he basically recruits a gentleman from England named Alcuin of York. And he comes over and begins a library. And so that starts what we call the Carolingian Renaissance. And that Renaissance was a moment where they really started trying to dig into finding ancient documents. So if you do study into some of these ancient events, you'll find a lot of documentation that begins around in the 800s or into the 9th century because of Charlemagne. So we have that, like in the Charlemagne library, we know that they had a list. They said that they had 9 of Cicero's individual speeches. And again, those are copies. So we can say for fragments from his Cicero, at least 150, maybe 250 years after composition. That's really good, right? Sallust, about 230 years. We also have some other physical evidence. So one of the guys who did the killing, Brutus, goes to war because a civil war breaks out eventually. And to pay his soldiers, he did what a lot of Roman generals did, is that he basically minted his own coins. And on he basically designed a coin that showed 2 daggers between what was known as the Liberty Cap, which was an ancient symbol of freedom. And on the back of it, it said EID-MAR, which stands for Oedibus Matius, which is Ides of March. So he basically made a coin saying, yep, I killed that guy.
Wow.
And so when you
made merch.
Yeah. When you know that there's this thing, we're able to say, okay, and it was made somewhere around 43, 42 BC. So we're able to, that's really good evidence that suggests that it supports the story that there was a man named Julius Caesar who was assassinated. Later, we know there was a funeral. At the funeral, this is when Mark Antony makes his famous speech. We know the crowd grabbed the body and burned it on a funeral pyre. And that funeral pyre location is known because they later in the empire built a temple, the temple of the deified Julius, which you and I have both physically seen when we were in Rome together.
That's right.
And so we went there, and people place flowers on the spot there now. Sounds great. We got a solid story.
Yeah.
But there are some discrepancies. First of all, et tu Brute is probably not what was said. But there is some sources that suggest he did say something. Other sources say he said nothing.
Okay.
We're not trying to figure out, you and me right now, like which is right. I'm just pointing out that in this solid story that everybody say, yep, I know all about this story with Caesar, you start realizing, oh, there's some discrepancies in the information, but we don't doubt the story.
Yeah.
The number of stab wounds. So a couple of the sources, ancient sources, say 23. Nicholas, though, says there were 35. Others say there might have been less because maybe he didn't need that many to kill him, and so there might have been more later just after he was already dead. So how many did it take to kill him? Was it 23? Was it less than 23? What was the weapon? Plutarch says there was a sword, but the others say there were only daggers. The likelihood is daggers, but nonetheless, just there's this difference. And he was killed by, we would say, a weapon. We know that much. We want to just kind of be loose about it. Where was he killed? A lot of times the suggestion is by some of the writings that he was killed in like the main room of the Senate. But the reality is it seems like the sources tell us he was killed in a place called the Portico of Pompeii. Then there's the idea that, well, it's done pretty much by Cassius and Brutus. However, according to Damascus, the Nicholas of Damascus, there's actually a third conspirator who might have been the real mastermind, Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus. A lot of names there.
Yeah.
But another Brutus, right? Again, you and I aren't trying to figure out whether he was or wasn't involved, but we're just saying who killed Caesar or who led the conspiracy.
Right.
You and I end up saying, well, there's these two guys, but there might have been a third dude. The point of all that is just to note that no historian doubts that there was a man named Julius Caesar, nor doubts that he was assassinated, doubts the date, and kind of doubts the general story that goes with it.
Right.
But our historical evidence leaves us in a place where, well, you kind of feel like if I really want to be picky, I could say there's discrepancies, but those discrepancies don't give me reason for pause as a historian. They actually give me some confidence to recognize that there wasn't like a made-up story that everybody wrote. You know, one dude wrote 5 different things. Instead, people are reporting an event. Just like if people were reporting the event differently of Reagan's assassination, they would have different details included and not included.
Yeah.
Can you see how that kind of works out there?
Yeah. I mean, we focus on where there's discrepancies and differences. It's like, okay, great. But let's, the other side of the coin is where do they not disagree? And where they don't disagree, I think all put together makes it compelling that, this did happen.
Yeah. There's so many events like this. Like I want to tell you, and I will in another episode about, for instance, the story of the famous Carthaginian general Hannibal crossing the Alps. There's other, even the thing we talked about with the Thermopylae, right? So if you look at the evidence there, we know the story about the 300s. But actually, according to some sources, there might have been, at the time of the death, 1,500 people. And then it's not totally clear if all 300 or everybody who was there was killed. Leonidas, by all accounts that we have evidence, was killed. And again, so we have a discrepancy based on the sources. And that can, again, what the historian's trying to do is build the story of probable certainty, the best narrative we can construct. But we don't doubt that there actually was a battle. The evidence is secure that there was a battle. There was the invasion. Leonidas was the king, or one of the 2 kings from Sparta. He goes up with his personal bodyguard. It does seem the best evidence suggests that certainly he and all of his people were killed. But maybe there were some who were there. There was a large group, like 6,000, 7,000 Greeks. Many of them were sent home. But at the last day of the last battle, it wasn't, from what we can tell, only 300. So this is what the historian has to deal with. They have to figure out how do we determine historicity and how do we learn to trust the evidence. And again, just to kind of recap as we're closing here, the number of copies we have from a document and then the length of time, the shorter in time is better for us. The majority of works from history, when we look at them in antiquity, are certainly reliable, even at a high degree of reliability. Like we don't have places. I mean, I mentioned Tacitus, and we have some volumes missing. So we just say we don't have those volumes. We don't try to guess and pretend. And some of the ones that only have like maybe 9 copies of something, we don't say, well, we can't trust this. We say we have 9 copies. That's amazing. We're so glad to have 9 copies. And now we can have this writing from this ancient source, and it's useful for us. There's certainly going to be some differences in manuscripts, mostly unintentional, because again, it's sort of over time, and you think about how the copyists did their works in these usually monasteries with low light, no eyeglasses. It's going to be not error-free or variant, again, better to say variant-free, but we trust those. And when we look at some of the differences, they're usually very, very minor. And the experts who get into the textual work and who are experts in a certain culture or certain language, they're easily able to kind of suss these out and acknowledge them. There's times when they go, well, we're not sure which of these it is. And if you're ever looking at something like the Iliad, there's other documents where you can find like the scholars version, and they really will then break down in all the footnotes. Like, we're not sure which of these 2 words, and again, it could be a misspelling or something like that. At no point in all that is there a concern that maybe we've been lied to. It's all fake. Or there's no way that could have happened. We're like, yeah, it really did happen. One reason I like the Hannibal story, it's the animals climbing the Pyrenees Mountains and the Alps, and having grown up in the mountains, I'm like, elephants can't climb mountains. But according to the sources, that they did. So what we'll do next time is we're going to look and see how do we then take this information and then consider the manuscripts and the documentation for the Bible, just on the source of the idea of questions of manuscript strength, so thus the historicity for those 66 documents that are in the book we call the Bible. And that's where we'll pick it up next time.
Count me in.
All right, man. See you then.
See you, Carl.
Thanks for joining us on Uncovered, the Bible as Historical Document. Be sure to follow or subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. If you have questions or comments, drop an email to carl@carlkriesman.com. This episode was produced and edited by Carl Kriesman and recorded at the Winter Park Public Library. The Winter Park Library promotes the free and open exchange of ideas and does not attempt to control or take responsibility for any opinions that may be expressed in this podcast. Opinions expressed in this podcast do not constitute or imply an endorsement or a reflection of the library's policies or beliefs. Our theme music was written and performed by Kyle Williams. A big thank you to everyone who supports the show. And if you'd like to help, visit carlkriesman.com/uncovered.